Hello and welcome. My name is Alan and we are back with more The Massacre at El Mozote. Today we'll be continuing along as we talk about how things kind of ramp up with their invasion into the village. So let's get into this. Let me turn my light on because my eyeballs are getting so bad I cannot see. Alright. While it was still dark, the soldiers came to Rufina's door and began pounding on it with the butts of the rifles. "Saugen!" they shouted once again. "Get out here!" The families were hustled outside. "We wanted to give our children food," Rufina says. But they said, "No, get out in the plaza." All around, the people were emerging from the houses. The soldiers pushed them along roughly, and in the darkness, they stumbled out of over the ground and bumped against one another. "Form lines!" the soldiers shouted. "Men and older boys over here, women and children over there." Soon all the people of El Mozote were lined up in the plaza. The soldiers ordered them not to move. They stood for hours. The children, having had no food and no rest, sobbed and fussed. The mothers tried to quiet them. The soldiers, unlike the evening before, said little. They just marched up and down the lines, looking real mean and ugly, not saying anything, Rufina says. And so the sun rose on the people of El Mozote that Friday. Around 7, they heard the sound of the helicopters approaching. As it hovered overhead, the soldiers began herding the people from the plaza. The men were ordered into the church, a small whitewashed building adjacent to the even smaller sacristy. The women and children were crowded into the house of Alfredo Marquez, a small building on the main street a few feet from the bigger house of Marcos Diaz, and directly opposite the church and the sacristy. Looking out a window of the tightly crowded house, well over 100 women and children had been forced into the space meant for perhaps a dozen. Rufina saw the helicopter touch down in the plaza and half a dozen officers climb out. She saw several of them, accompanied by soldiers of the Atrocities, stride in the church where the men were being held. The others came marching to the house where she was and pushed through the door into the packed, noisy room. They had bayonets on their guns and they used them to push the women back, Rufina says. They said we were collaborators. They were angry. They kept asking us where our people were, where the men had hidden our guns, and when we kept saying again and again that we didn't have any, they'd push at us with the bayonets. Then they'd say, "Shut up, old woman. What are you crying about?" They said they'd kill us if we didn't tell them. After only a few moments, the officers strode out, leaving soldiers to guard the door. Around this time, the helicopter lifted off, taking at least some of the officers along. Now that the women began to hear shouting from the church, we could hear them yelling, "The men," Rufina says. They were screaming, "No, no, don't do this to us. Don't kill us." Then she heard the screams. Rufina, who, together with her children, had been sitting on a bench with her back to the front wall of the house, the wall facing the church, climbed up on the bench so that she could look out a small window high up in that wall. Through the window she saw soldiers leading groups of men from the little whitewashed church, blindfolded men whose hands were bound behind them. Each pair of soldiers led 5 or 6 men past the house of Alfredo Marquez and took them out of the hamlet in various directions. After a time, she saw her husband in one group, and as she watched, along with the young Cristino, who had climbed up next to her, eager to see what was happening, they both saw him. Domingo Claros, 29-year-old woodcutter, husband of Rufina and father of Cristino, Maria Dolores, Marta Lilian, and Maria Isabel, bolt forward together with another man in a desperate effort to escape the soldiers. But there was nowhere to run. The men of the Atlacado leveled their M16s and brought both men down with short bursts of fire. Then the soldiers strode forward to where the men lay gasping on the ground, and unsheathing their machetes, they bent over them, grasped their hair, jerked their heads back sharply, and beheaded them with strong blows to the back of their necks. I got down from the bench and I hugged my children to me, Rufina says. My son was crying and saying over and over, "They killed father." I was crying. I knew then that they were all being taken away to be killed. I just hugged my children to me and cried. While the officers had been questioning the women, other officers and soldiers were interrogating the men in the church. Many of the men were bound, blindfolded, and forced to lie face down on the ground while they were interrogated, according to the Tutela legal report, which was evidently compiled with the cooperation of at least one soldier who had been present. The soldiers would step on their backs and pull their heads back by their hair until they screamed in pain. For all their brutality, however, the interrogations of the men appear to have been almost as perfunctory as those of the women. The officers devoted scarcely an hour to questioning the hundreds of supposed collaborators, which makes it difficult to believe that they really expected to acquire useful intelligence from the people of El Mozote. At about 8 o'clock, various of the men had been gathered in the church, were lifted off the ground and decapitated with machetes by soldiers, according to the Tutela report. The soldiers dragged the bodies and the heads of the decapitated victims to the convent of the church, where they were piled together. It must have been at this point that the women in the house across the street began to hear the men screaming. Decapitation is tiring work and slow, and more than 100 men were crammed into that small building. After the initial beheadings, it is unclear how many died inside the church. The soldiers began bringing the men out in groups, and it was from one of the first of the groups that Domingo Claros had attempted to escape. While Rufina huddled with her children in the crowded house, mourning her husband, other women climbed up on the bench beside her and peered out the small window. From here, they too saw the soldiers taking groups of men from the church and marching them off in different directions. Outside the hamlet, on a hill known as El Pinalito, the guides from Perquin waited in the company of several corporals. The officers had ordered them to stay there, lest they become confused with the townspeople during the operation. And throughout the morning, the guides watched the soldiers pass. I saw them marching groups of maybe 10 each. One guide told me they were all blindfolded and they had their hands tied behind their backs. Then we would hear the shots, the bursts from the rifles. Out in the forest, the soldiers forced the men to the ground and ordered them to lie flat, and their faces against the earth, as they had lain with their families the evening before. Then the soldiers lowered their M16s and fired bursts into each man's brain. All morning you could hear the shots, the crying, and the screaming. Rufina says, in the house of Alfredo Marquez, some of the children had become hysterical, and no one knew how to calm them. Cristino begged his mother tearfully to take them out of the house, lest they be killed, and he had seen father killed. Rufina could do nothing but point helplessly to the guards and try to calm him. None of the women had any idea what would happen next. We just cried and hugged one another. Around midday, the group of soldiers came into the house. Now it's your turn, women, one of the soldiers said. They were going to take the women out in groups. Out now in groups, the soldier explained. And then, he said, the women would be free to go to their homes or down to Gotera or wherever they liked. With that, the soldiers began picking out one by one the younger women and the girls and calling them forward to the door. The girls would hang on to their mothers, and the soldiers would come in and just grab them from their mothers. Rufina says there was a lot of screaming and shouting. Everyone was screaming, "No, no, don't do this!" But the soldiers would hit the mothers with the butts of their rifles, and they would reach behind and grab the girls and pull them along with them. From the house of Alfredo Marquez, the soldiers marched the group of young women and girls, some of them as young as 10 years old, out of the hamlet and up the hills known as El Chingo and La Cruz. Before long, the women in the house could hear screams coming from the hills. The guides on Pinalito nearby also heard the screaming. We could hear the women being raped on the hills, the Perkin man told me. And then, the soldiers would pass by, coming from there, and they'd talk about it. They were talking and joking, saying how much they liked the 12-year-olds. In the midst of this, one or perhaps two helicopters accounts differ, as they do about many details of the story, touched down in the plaza in front of the church, and a number of officers climbed out. From his vantage point on the hill, the guide says he recognized the distinctive figure of an officer he had seen several times before. Colonel Jaime Ernesto Flores Grijalba, the commander of the 3rd Brigade. In San Miguel, who was widely known as El Gordo, the Fat Man. Along with officers accompanying Colonel Flores, the one famous figure, a small but charismatic man whom the soldiers of the Atlacado proudly pointed out to the guide, Lieutenant Colonel Domingo Monterosa, their beloved commander. The officers having been received at their helicopter by Major Caceres and the company captains, were escorted to a house not far from the church and disappeared inside. After some time, during which the killings went on around El Mozote, and also in the adjacent hamlet of Tierra Colorada, where patrolling Atlacado troops had began shooting people they found hiding in the houses, the officers strode out onto the common, climbed back into their helicopter, and lifted off from El Mozote. Around this time, the soldiers returned to the house of Alfredo Marquez. I was still sitting on the bench with my kids, Rufina says. When they came back, they began separating the women from the kids, and they pulled the mothers away, leaving the children there crying. They took one group of women, and then in a while they came back and took another. That was the saddest thing. Little by little, the mothers disappeared, and the house became filled mostly with crying children. Rufina found herself in one of the last groups. It must have been 5 o'clock. There were maybe 20 of us. I was crying and struggling with the soldiers because I had my baby on my chest. It took 2 soldiers to pull the baby away from me. So when I came outside into the street, I was the last in the group. I was crying and miserable and begging God to help me. The soldiers marched the women down the main street. They passed the houses of Marcos Diaz on the right side, and on the left that of Ambrosiano Claros, where Rufina and her family had spent the previous night. Ambrosiano Claros's house was in flames. I saw other houses burning, and I saw blood on the ground. We turned the corner and walked toward the house of Israel Marquez. Then the women at the head of the line, we were in single file, began to scream. She had looked through the door and seen the people in the house. What the woman had seen was thick pools of blood covering the floor, and farther inside, piles of bloody corpses. The bodies of the women who were only minutes before had been sitting in the house with them, waiting. The first woman screamed, "There are dead people! They're killing people!" And everyone began screaming. All down the line, the women began resisting, hugging one another, begging the soldiers not to kill them. The soldiers were struggling with them, trying to push the first women into the house. One soldier said, "Don't cry, women. Here comes the devil to take you." Rufina, still at the end of the line, fell to her knees. "I was crying and begging God to forgive my sins," she says. "Though I was almost at the feet of the soldiers, I wasn't begging them, I was begging God. There I was, kneeling. I was between a crabapple and a pine tree. Maybe that was what saved me in all the yelling and commotion. They didn't see me there. The soldier behind me had gone up front to help with the first women. They didn't see me when I crawled between the trees. The crabapple tree, which still stands next to the ruin of Israel Marquez's house, as gnarled and twisted as an old crabapple, as one can imagine, was within about 15 feet of the house. I couldn't move. I couldn't even cry," Rufina says. "I had to remain absolutely still and silent. The whole group was still outside the house, the women grabbing one another and hugging one another and crying and trying to resist. Finally, the soldiers pushed some of them into the house. I couldn't see inside, but I started hearing shots and screams. Finally, when the screams and the gunfire had stopped, some of the soldiers went off. A few minutes later, they returned, pushing along the last group of women, and now Rufina heard the sequence, the cries of terror, the screaming, the begging, and the shooting, all over again. After a time, those women ceased. In the sudden silence, scattered shooting and fainter screams could be heard echoing from the hills. A few feet from where Rufina lay hidden behind the tree, 9 or 10 soldiers had laid down their guns and collapsed wearily to the ground. "Well, all these old bastards are dead," one said. "Go ahead and burn the house." We'll go ahead and end this part there. But yeah, just a systematic terrorization and slaughter. They first slaughter all the men and the older boys, because of course they're most likely the first to fight back, if any will. They then rape these girls. And then decide to take women and have them shot. Luckily, Rufina ended up in a spot where she wasn't seen. But yeah. She could hear everything. She could see everything. It's not for the faint of heart, because these are direct accounts of the atrocities committed. Yeah. I mean, what do you really say? They've massacred. They've raped. You know, just, oh, it's just part of war. The village had nothing to do with any of what was going on. And remember, this is all the push to stop communism. Oh, goodness. Anyway. As always, educate thyself. Think, read, study, learn. Someone tries to tell you something you have trouble believing, ask them to cite their sources. I'll see you all in the next episode. Until then, later.